Carbide set up a chemical process plant in a rural Indian community. The protests of thousands of members of the local community were ignored by government, police, and the corporation itself. When the plant exploded, killing tens of thousands, it was that community which bore the cost. We think they should be better represented in the decision-making process. What am I going to tell you today, Mr. Speaker? I'm going to tell you that in the trade-off in industrialisation in the developing world, often the most underrepresented in these decisions are the ones we need to prioritise, and they are the local communities. I'm going to do this through three main points. Firstly, what is the nature of industrialisation? Secondly, why local communities are the best place to make this trade-off. And thirdly, why we ultimately get better outcomes under our model. But firstly, how exactly are we going to do this? Okay, so we have 5 main points to our model, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, when an industrialised project is going to take place, we understand that they're going to have to campaign with the public, Mr. Speaker. So what is going to happen, both proponents and opponents are going to have to make active campaigning processes within these local communities to provide information about the benefits and the negative outcomes of these kinds of projects, Mr. Speaker. So we understand that this is going to happen through a referendum, and popular consensus is going to be needed in order to make a decision of whether or not this project is going to go forth. Thirdly, we're going to have electoral commissions in place to ensure that these are actually conducted in the best manner possible and to ensure that there is going to be no fraud within these referendums. Thirdly, we understand and contextualise this debate specifically within the developing world because we think this is actually where it's most important and where we see this trade-off is negatively impacting local communities the most. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, we understand on the affirmative side of the House that it's actually incredibly difficult to enforce these kinds of measures within the developing world, but we think it's important to actually make an effort to do something, Mr. Speaker. So we're willing to try, and we're willing to try and get better, and we think with our model, it's actually going to happen within the future. Firstly, what is the nature of industrialisation? So industrialisation and these kinds of projects we're talking about in this debate, Mr. Speaker, is about the trading off of interests. So when you create a dam, what ultimately happens is that you displace a lot amount of people and you use a lot amount of land, Mr. Speaker. When you create a mining industry, you ultimately ruin a huge amount of the environment, Mr. Speaker. So what happens is, specifically within the developing world, we see there is a huge prioritisation of these industrialised projects, Mr. Speaker, because there is this notion that these projects are good to economically stimulate these economies, which we do agree with, Mr. Speaker, but what we see is that these local communities are massively underrepresented within the decision-making of these projects. Okay, so what we see in this trade-off is there's clear winners and losers. And what we identify the problem today, Mr. Speaker, is that the losers are far underrepresented within this decision-making process, and the winners are far too overrepresented. Okay. So why do we think this, right? 2 reasons. First, the local communities are the ones who are going to bear the environmental offsets of these kinds of projects because they are obviously in such close proximity with them, like in the instances of the Union Carbide explosion. And secondly, because we actually identify them as being the only long-term interest group with these kinds of projects, Mr. Speaker, they are always going to be in this area, Mr. Speaker. We think this is incredibly important because firstly, they bear the costs, and secondly, because often they are the employees and the ones actually bringing the benefits to these kinds of projects. On to my second point. Why local communities are the best place to make this trade-off. Firstly, local communities have the best kind of information and best access to knowledge about the local area, Mr. Speaker. They are the ones who have lived there. They have a relationship to the environment. They understand what kind of costs can be offset in a project like this, Mr. Speaker. We think, and we strongly believe on this side of the House, that they are the ones who can properly assess in respect to their community whether or not a project is actually worthwhile going ahead for. Secondly, we think government reps are actually incredibly underrepresented in these kinds of industrialised projects and the decision-making surrounding them. Why? Firstly, we don't actually have a lot of lobby interests, right, Mr. Speaker, because these are incredibly poor communities. We think that the government often prioritises their economic interests over the fact that these projects often largely have incredibly social and environmental detrimental impacts, right, Mr. Speaker. And secondly to this, we think that these people are actually often bribed by the actual corporations who are coming in. So again, Mr. Speaker, you see that the local communities are the ones who are missing out on this decision-making process. Okay, so why does this change under our model, Mr. Speaker? It changes because of the fact that when we implement our model, we have a referendum that engages the entire local community. You cannot bribe one government official, Mr. Speaker. You cannot bribe a couple people to make sure that your corporation comes in and it ruins an entire local community. Okay, good. And also, further to this, moving on. Last point, how do we actually get better outcomes under our model? Firstly, we believe it actually leads to more informed decisions. As I prefaced within my model, Mr. Speaker, what's going to happen within this kind of process is the fact that both the proponents and the opponents are going to be making campaigns actively distributing information about these kinds of industrialised projects that are going ahead, right? So what does this actually happen? What is this actually occurring, and how is this good? Firstly, Mr. Speaker, we actually think that it's incredibly good for the fact that these local communities have the best access to the information about whether this is going to be incredibly benefiting for their local community or whether it's going to be incredibly detrimental for their community, Mr. Speaker. We think because of this, it provides they can make an incredibly informed decision about whether or not they think it's good to go ahead with. So what do we think this actually results in, Mr. Speaker? 3 things. As I said first, they are better able to actually consent to this. Secondly, we think that it actually alleviates negative effects, right? So what do I mean by this? When we actually engage the local community with these kinds of decision-making process, they might say, sure, we're willing to accept a nuclear power plant coming in, but what do we do to get around the issues that causes environmentally? Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, they are able to engage new ways to get around those kinds of environmental issues because we give them a kind of bargaining power within this relationship, Mr. Speaker. They currently have absolutely no power within these decision-making processes because we don't give them any we don't legitimise them at all, Mr. Speaker. So we think of the fact that they are better able to lobby Parliament and actually have a voice in this kind of discussion is incredibly better. Lastly, we don't actually think it's going to lead to many different decisions, Mr. Speaker, because of the fact that if this project is going to be incredibly benefiting for these communities, we actually think they're going to side with it, but if not, they have the opportunity to not. What have I said today in this speech, Mr. Speaker? I've told you that often these countries prioritise these kinds of projects, which often is incredibly detrimental to many societies, and we think we're all about giving them a voice and letting them have a decision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the first affirmative speaker and welcome the first speaker from the executive team to commence their case.
Absolute tragedy that the affirmative team wanted to set this debate in the third world. What an absolute tragedy that 200 individuals in a rural community in India would be able to stifle attempts to get clean water to areas in Asia that do not have access to clean water, which would benefit their health, their economy, and prevent them from being dirt poor and dying on the street. What an absolute tragedy that was always, or most often, going to happen under the opposition's model. Two main points of rebuttal. First off, about how these individuals are the best people to make this decision, and second of all, how this leads to the best outcomes. First off, onto the individuals and the principled matter of the government being able to make this decision. First off, the opposition want to tell us that this decision is always going to be about trading off interests, and that it is necessary and important for the individuals that are affected by these decisions to have their interests heard. First off, all government decisions that any government ever makes are always about trading interests. When we decide where the budget money goes, there's always opportunity cost involved, where you're taking money away from another area of the government and giving it to someone else. But we don't see that those individuals that are affected get a certain prioritised say in how that is determined. We already have, for instance, in India, the biggest democracy in the world. They already get to have their say in choosing the government, so clearly they're already able to be represented. Then she wanted to tell us, for instance, so we don't see why this is any different to any other decision that governments make, because all government decisions in economics, in social areas or whatever, are always going to be a trading off in one person's interests for majority of interests. So, then she wanted to tell us that the losers, though, are underrepresented for whatever reason. First off, we'd say they're not underrepresented. The reason that they don't have a particularly loud voice is because there simply aren't that many of them in comparison to the millions of people that these projects affect. For instance, dams, wind power, mining, etc., which allow electricity and resources to go to larger communities. Then she wanted to tell us that they bear the cost when things go really tragically wrong. First off, we think that if we implement schemes which will, and we have seen this in developing nations where they're implementing better schemes and making sure these projects are more safe, that is going to benefit them anyway. We also see these people are able to get compensated when these things go wrong in the first place. Then she wanted to tell us that these are the best people to be able to make this decision. No, we don't think that these best people, onto the second issue about the best people making the decision. We don't think these individuals are the best people to be making this decision. I've already said about how there are so few people who are putting a bargaining chip or the power in the hands of a very small minority. But furthermore, this minority that is tiny also is not equipped to be able to make this decision. Firstly, because we're talking about rural communities in India of about 200 people or even larger, but still very small. Furthermore, though, these rural communities in India do not have an economics degree, high and likely. If they do, though, they've probably perhaps never even been to the city to be able to see the perception of how this is going to change and affect the majority of people. Oftentimes, if we're going to talk about developing nations, unfortunately and tragically, these people won't be educated, and that is a real travesty, and will actually get worse under their model when we don't have economic stimulus in that area. But furthermore, she said that these are the best people because they are directly affected. Ladies and gentlemen, if we always gave a privileged right to choose whether or not something was decided on the government basis to the people that were most affected, nothing would get done, okay? If we gave China the ability to change the pension age and that responsibility to decide whether or not that happened solely to pensioners, that would never change, because pensioners are never going to allow to do that. That's really bad, because that harms everyone else in society, because they are the only people that get to make that self-interested decision. That's really negative, and that's not how government ever works. We always focus on the majority of interests. Then she wanted to tell us that they are better able to consent. But she also spoke about how mining companies and things have so much more power than smaller rural individuals. So clearly those mining companies would then launch a lot of propaganda, etc., and they would be flooded with that anyway, and probably, perhaps, vote in favour. She's going to be pro-consent. That's never going to exist anyway. Then she wanted to tell us that these individuals were better able to lobby for their interests, but then also said at the same time that these individuals aren't able to lobby because they're in developing nations. I was quite confused. Then she wanted to say that, what will mean is that at the moment, mining companies or whatever are going to bribe communities in order to get to what they want. I think that will happen more often under the opposition's model, because these mining companies will want to sway people in order to get their way, in order for them to vote. That's really negative, because it means, first off, it could be prohibitively expensive for those mining companies or development companies. Furthermore, it slows down the approval process of this being able to happen. But it also means, what do we do with this money? If we're just giving stackloads of cash to rural communities that have never had that money, it's not going to go to infrastructure and resources, which is going to benefit them in the long term. That is really damaging. Two main points are substantive, but firstly, what we're going to do about the supposed problem. We are going to implement to make sure that workplace health and safety is always maintained within developing nations and things like that. We already see at the moment that in India, for instance, approval by the government must happen in order for these projects to go through. We think government should be able and must make decisions on the basis of whether or not it affects the majority. That's super important. Two main points are substantive. Firstly, that we need to represent the best interests of the majority of individuals affected, and secondly, that this prevents a lot of economic projects going through. That's really bad for the economy at large. Now to this first point about the best interest of the people. Democracy is always about what best benefits the majority. That's why it's called that. It's really important because everyone will always act in their own self-interest. If you give individuals, and the only individuals that are going to be affected by a decision in a certain way, negatively in this case, if you go by the opposition's logic, they are always going to vote against it. That's really bad, because it means these economic decisions are always going to hurt a particular group of individuals. That's how it always works. It's always a trade-off, so we never get anything done. The problem is that for every dam built, someone else benefits, and we really need those people to benefit through clean water, etc. The difference is, though, is that these people opt into living there. They can always move away, and that was never a reason why they should be given this huge bargaining chip to be able to have huge control over people. We're talking about a tiny minority as well. We're talking about tiny rural communities spread out, and they shouldn't be able to have this power. But furthermore, if you're going to talk about how the minority of people are able to decide over the majority because they are so greatly affected, I'd also like to know if this is going to be a democratic decision. And within that minority, even if it's passed, say for instance 10% of the community goes against the decision, why that 10% that has gone against the decision of having the mining company in there, if their minority interests count so much because they're affected, why would you let it pass in the first place? Because majority rule always works under the principle of the opposition. Second point of substantive, because this will always hurt communities when you don't let mining projects and things like that go through. For every mine that is created in India or in China, that is always going to have benefits. You get the benefits of taxes, which goes to government to spend on infrastructure. This is so important in developing nations in order to build roads and schools and hospitals to improve their standard of living. You also create jobs through having mines and things like that. For every dam that is built, the best thing is that provides clean water, the prevention of floods when typhoons hit and things like that, which benefits the majority of individuals in the first place. It is solely responsible for getting third world nations or developing nations up into the developed sphere. That is super important. It is a tragedy under the opposition that will almost never happen because 200 individuals or 1,000 individuals get to veto certain decisions that affect millions of people. That is so damaging. So, because we stand for the majority of individuals, because we want India to be able to lift up out of the poverty cycle, and because we want clean water and fresh air and electricity to go to these individuals, we were so proud to oppose.
I thank the first speaker. Now welcome the second of them to begin their studies.
I'll take the phone.
I watch a lot of the West Wing. Mr. Speaker, if it was true that the economic science of industrialisation as a part of development was the truest and surest way that it would distribute benefits to the entire country, that everyone would benefit, and that any marginal costs to remote communities that ultimately did not really matter, and that those interests and risks were very, very small, then why on earth would those communities not vote in favour? If it is true the characterisation of the negative teams model is true, that these communities are dirt poor, that they have no prospect, that they are dying in the street, Mr. Speaker, from poverty, we think that our model facilitates convincing those communities that it is in fact in their best interests to have a job and no longer be in poverty and to actually be less poor. Ultimately, we think that is the decision the vast majority of communities will make, because it is the decision the vast majorities of people make under the status quo. The problem is that in certain circumstances, individual communities are disproportionately affected in a manner that is unrepresented by the democratic system, allegedly the one that exists in India, and ultimately we think that we should shift the balance in their favour. I have 3 points of rebuttal before I get into my substantive about the nature of multinational corporations and why the benefits to development is actually dramatically overstated, especially by the negative team. The first one is it true that communities will always say no, building on my introduction? The second is this an unsustainable, unprincipled trade-off? And the final one will discuss generally whether or not it is capable to achieve their model by any other means. Firstly, will they always say no? Realistically, there are so many examples, Mr. Speaker, where people within the context of a nation as a whole do not operate within their own within their own interests and operate in the interests of the country as a whole. There was a world's debate once about nationalism and why nationalism as a motivating force is incredibly important for people to absorb costs to themselves for the benefit of the whole. And we think that India actually has a really strong system of civic nationalism that forces people to say that I will accept a cost in the short term to contribute to a greater whole. It's why taxation systems are so robust in modern democracies, because they recognise that it is a part of themselves they should give back to the whole and that everyone in the context of it becomes stronger. But if in a developing community that idea of civic nationalism does not exist, then it is on the obligation of the government to say that if an individual is to suffer a particular cost, they should do so only because it delivers benefits to the whole. They shouldn't do that process in the reverse, by saying you are suffering a cost in the short term, but it might lead to benefits in the long term, although realistically they're not actually communicating that benefit in any particular respect, because the status quo is one whereby there is no communication of information whatsoever. And ultimately we think this is not only possible, it is in the interests of government generally to do, but they bear the burden of doing it first, and ultimately we don't think people will always say no. We think realistically they will likely say yes to these kinds of projects in the future, but not only do we give them bargaining power by where they can continue to bargain for their own interests, but even in the absence of all of that, they at least have the information that the things going on in their communities are harmful. That was the biggest problem with the Union Carbide disaster. No one knew that it was a chemical plant that was processing extremely dangerous chemicals, and so when it exploded and killed thousands and thousands of people, ultimately that was as a result of the fact that no one was able to move away from those communities because they didn't know it was happening. Second, is this an unsustainable trade-off of interest? It is true that under the status quo, in a democracy, it is about the aggregation of interests generally. But we gave you a couple of things that are pretty unique in this circumstance. First, unlike most interests within a budget, when you remove a dollar, that is still a marginal utility of a dollar. However, in these cases, it's not as simple as saying my interests in an environment are fungible, and therefore they can be immediately equated to someone else's. The interests of these people are not only their livelihoods, but also, in most circumstances, their lives. So we're happy to shift the balance in their favour. Saying that equally this is different to pensions is very true. We are isolating and encouraging particular interests more than others. But in the same way that a constitution identifies and solidifies certain interests that require much more difficulty to change. The fact that in the United States, the majority of people oppose the current level of gun regulation, but they can't change it because it ingrained in the Constitution is representative of the fact that at certain times we identify and prioritise particular interests are more important that require the consensus of an entire country in order to be changed. We think that this is pretty good. Finally, in terms of the nature, under this point, in terms of the nature of these communities, it is not true that they are small, especially in the context of India. Industrialisation projects are country-wide and require the construction of huge numbers of businesses. And this isn't limited to mines or dams, although they are the biggest ones. All forms of industrialisation projects have risks to local communities. Like the entire Uruguay was at one point basically strip mined for oil. You can't strip mine for oil. The thing that you do with oil, you pull it out of the ground. Ultimately, those things were done in the entirety of Uruguay and polluted waterways that didn't just provide local communities with water, but provided the entire country with water. And ultimately, those were the things that became polluted. No clean water, no dams, ultimately environmental devastation and destruction for the benefits that went to a few. This is not the case where a minority is being inconvenienced for the betterment of the whole. It is the majority being inconvenienced for the benefit of the minority. Finally, are there other ways? It is probably true that in a perfect world, that in Western societies, for example, most industrialization projects do occur in a context whereby you have a stable and robust democracy that isn't susceptible to bribes, as perhaps developing countries necessarily are. So not only does our model have a particular influence and impact in those particular circumstances, ultimately we think that it is insufficient for the negative team, as we are the affirmative, to ultimately identify a separate model whereby they can achieve exactly the same thing and say that no environmental regulations, which would equally make projects unavailable under their side, are suddenly an interest that should be represented. And ultimately, it's also about the information and the absorption of risk. Fukushima was one of the safest nuclear plants in the world, but the fact that all of the local communities were aware of the fact that it was still potentially unsafe was really, really important when it did, in fact, melt down to the detriment of all of the people who lived around it. There are intrinsic costs in those calculations that cannot always be regulated out by the negative team's model. But okay, what am I going to talk about in substantive? It is ultimately the nature of multinational corporations that mean that they do not often deliver the benefits to local communities espoused by the negative team. Far be it from me to comment on the water system in India that I do not know particularly about. Perhaps also other World's Grand Finals can inform me more. But in particular, the assertion by the negative team that multinational corporations have benefits for those communities in terms of increased employment is dramatically overstated. The reality of multinational corporations and the construction of mines is not that multinational corporations benefit local communities. It is in fact the opposite. Multinational corporations come in, absorb the vast majority of the profits from schemes like construction of dams and schemes like like strip mining, and remove those resources, and those profits flow back to their countries of origin. That is not borne out in specific examples. That is borne out by the entire experience of modern development, whereby developing countries constructed mines, the benefits did not flow to the very limited number of individuals that worked on the mines, who were often imported from other countries as they were either cheaper or they were from their country of origin, and those were the only ones with the expertise and the people who they trusted. It is very untrue to say that very impoverished people in India or in China, for example, have the technological capacity to even construct a dam in the first place, and it's much cheaper just simply to ship one over from the country that you come from. Ultimately, however, this also means that multinational corporations have no long-term interest in those communities. They don't care how wages are distributed, and the fact that often you can't just go down to your local store and buy something because there is no store there, and a multinational corporation sure isn't going to set one up for you. And ultimately, it means that the benefit of those multinational corporations is exceptionally limited, not just to those communities, but in fact to the country as a whole. We ultimately think this is justified under our model in that we shift the balance of interests, and ultimately, if it is in the best interests of the country, and it is in the best interests, as espoused by the majority of economists, they can lobby and convince communities of that fact first. We are very proud to propose.
Thanks, Stephen, for his speech, and welcome the second negative speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, the issue in this debate was that the kinds of projects we were talking about, things like dams, things like renewable energy stations, all these kinds of things were things that had a huge amount of benefit to a huge amount of people, particularly in developing countries where resources are scarce and people don't have the kinds of facilities that we do in developed countries. What was always going to happen when you put the decision about whether or not that project would go ahead in the hands of a small group of people who are not necessarily well informed is that that project doesn't go ahead, and that hurts a huge amount of people, more than we think is ever conscionable. We think that that is a disaster, and because of that I have 2 points in rebuttal. Firstly, what is the nature of industrialisation, and secondly, are local communities best placed to make this decision and what benefit do they derive? So firstly, they wanted to tell us that we're trading off interests when we allow these projects to go ahead without the approval of developing communities. They wanted to tell us that the losers in this situation are underrepresented. We would not necessarily say that they're underrepresented, but they are less represented, potentially than other interests, for example, the government, which represents the interests of the rest of the country. We would say that that is definitely an acceptable state of affairs, given that there are far less people in that local community than there are in the rest of the country, and all those people have a stake. That's why Catherine brought you the incredibly important principle of democracy, which says that everyone's interest should be held to the same importance in that situation, and we shouldn't allow small groups who have a particular self-interest in that policy to hold the rest of the country and indeed the government to ransom to be able to get exactly what they wanted. That's a really significant problem. But secondly, they wanted to tell us that also these groups should have more of a say than everyone else because they're the only long-term interest group. We say that's absolutely incorrect. If anything, the local community is the shortest-term interest group because they may not even live there for the entire life of the mine or the dam. The longest-term interest group is everyone else who is going to rely on that power station or that dam for power or water for the entire time that they're living in that country and that that dam or that project is in action. We thought that they were probably the most important stakeholder, given that people in the local community were able, even if they didn't want to move out of that area if they found it so difficult to live there. That was a possibility for those people. They weren't the longest-term stakeholder and they certainly weren't a permanent one. But then they wanted to bring us an idea about, oh, this is about civic nationalism. People won't hold these policies to ransom because people have an incentive to do what's best for the country. Which is it? Either people act in their self-interest and do things which don't benefit the country, or people sacrifice their self-interest and do what's best for the country, thereby foregoing the benefits you asserted that they would have. That is a problem. Because the issue is that if people are willing to do things for the sake of civic nationalism, then then they don't derive the benefits of protection from these kinds of policies that you wanted to assert that they would get. But the issue is that even if civic nationalism is like a thing that would happen, those people can still sometimes say no to things that would be really, really good for them. And even if that only happens a very small amount of times, that's a massive harm that you don't fix on your side of the debate. But secondly, on these issues of what's better for local communities, are they best placed to make this decision? They wanted to tell us that people should assess, with respect to their own personal circumstances, what should happen to their community because they live there and they know what it's like to live there. So, firstly, we think that is too narrow of a stakeholder to have the absolute say over whether or not a project that affects an entire country goes ahead. Because let's be very clear, you told us at first that you wanted these people to make this decision with respect to their own self-interest and the interests of their community. Why are those interests always placed above those of the wider country? We think that that's a massive problem. But also they wanted to tell us that people beforehand were bribed and now they will not be. Well, firstly, we think that if bribery was an issue, that it still will be under your system. But also we think that people can be now bribed by lobby groups to accept deals that are bad for them anyway. And so if that's an issue that leads people to do things which are not in their self-interest as well, and that's a problem. They wanted to tell us it's also better for the environment. No, you told us you wanted people to take into account local interests, not environmental interests. We think some of these projects are things which are really good for the environment, particularly when we're talking about renewable energies in developing countries which have huge issues with their environmental impacts. We think that people are able to say no to projects which really help the environment, and that's a problem as well. They wanted to tell us that there's more interest now because both sides of the debate are able to give information on this. We think that people are able to disregard that information as well and continually act in their self-interest. If their self-interest is in contravention of that information, we think it's really, really bad that they were able to exercise that self-interest contrary to expert advice that this was better for the economy, better for the environment, what have you. Quickly, on MNCs, they wanted to tell us that MNCs will go in and not necessarily give jobs to people in local communities, and so there aren't necessarily benefits associated with that. I'm going to tell you in my substantive why I think that is not the case, but also we think that the government of that country is still able to make a decision as to whether or not to lease that land to that MNC to allow them to come in and set up that mine. So even if people don't derive a direct benefit in, say, getting a job, working on a mine or working on a dam, that government receives a huge benefit, receiving a huge amount of revenue or a huge amount of rent for that mine. That's a huge benefit because that goes on to increase that country's GDP and affect all those people who are living in poverty. If that's the case, it's really, really terrible that people can say no to that, and that's a terrible thing to do. I have 2 points in substantive. Firstly, we think that communities miss out on the benefits of industrialisation, and we think this allows those communities to then hold governments to ransom. So firstly, on missing out on benefits, Kat told you at first that people are very, very likely in these communities to say no to these projects for a variety of reasons. We think that's a problem because it's likely a decision that's made reasonably quickly and without adequate consideration of the benefits, and also is not necessarily representative of everyone in that community's interests. We think people, therefore, are likely to miss out or bar other people from the benefits associated with that development. We know that those industries do definitely generate low-skilled jobs, which are hugely beneficial for people in developing countries, in mines, in dams, construction jobs, which are excellent. That is really good. But also it generates income for associated industries like accommodation, food, transport. All those industries which developing countries are able to access are benefited when there's a mine or something to attract business and workers. But also it increases the value of that land or that property near that mine, which is a really important thing because it means those people in developing countries have more wealth in their land. As we saw in Australia, mining towns had life breathed into them by mining industries. That was a really important benefit. We thought something similar could definitely happen in developing countries, and it was terrible if people said no to that because of their own short-term self-interest in that community. But secondly, on holding the government to ransom. We think that when these reforms are hugely necessary, as they often will be in developing countries where water or power is scarce and the government desperately needs that reform to go ahead, they're forced to find a way to be able to do that. In a lot of cases, we think how that will look is buying off lobby groups, offering to build things in that community, offering to pay that community, and we think people will be encouraged by lobby groups to seek out that deal for their community. Why is that disastrous? Firstly, we think it puts a huge burden on a government which is already spread too thin and which is already poor. We think it has to incur more debt to be able to get through something that it wouldn't otherwise have had to pay a community to have done before their model was introduced. That limits the number of projects this government is able to have across the board. So if the government needs X amount of dams, it can't have X amount of dams because suddenly that all becomes much, much more expensive if the government wants to be able to get that through, because not only does it have to pay for the dam, it has to buy off the local communities. We think that that is a really big harm. But we also think it's not appropriate, particularly in the developing world, for the government to be spending huge amounts of money on small communities who have an arbitrary interest in a piece of land that they're living on. So because we think it's unfair for the government to privilege the interests or to buy off certain citizens in a situation where everyone is poor, we're very proud to propose a
Before my hands is like that. Is this streaming live?
Speak up and I'd like to welcome the third affirmative to conclude this case.
Mr. Speaker, the characterization that we got from side opposition was essentially that local communities are really, really poor and they don't have enough lobbying interest or any power whatsoever to create any kind of social change, yet they would hold the government to ransom if we pass this motion. That's a very contradictory characterization, and I will show you why that does not stand today. The problem we identified on side proposition. We told you that local communities are now shoved with industries that they don't know about, like Union Carbide, just because a government believes that that will propel development, and we said that that's principally wrong and also practically and structurally incorrect. Our solution was increase awareness, let the communities then decide if that would actually bring about the benefits that the government